Now we return to chapter 11 to see the gram-positive bacteria. We just finished listing out all the gram-negative bacteria that we probably will cover in terms of disease-causing pathogens in this chapter. Now we're on to the gram-positives. So first we're going to talk about low G plus C, low GC gram-positives. That means that if we break down their genomic DNA into all nucleotide bases and we sum up all the G's and C's, it'll be much lower in percentage than the A's and T's. So there's a little chart showing the different groups that we'll be looking at. Um, the phylum of these low GC gram-positive bacteria is called Firmicutes. All right, Clostridia. That's our first group, and they're rod-shaped obligate anaerobes. They have to be in anaerobic conditions. Clostridium tetani causes the disease called tetanus, which we learned way back when in chapter 9 about mussels, is borrowed from the idea that high frequency stimulation of muscle cells causes maximum tension, a condition called fused tetanus. Well, here's a toxin from the Clostridium tetani bacteria that causes tetanus or paralysis, paralytic contractions of skeletal muscles. We'll talk more about the mechanism of that later, probably a little bit. Clostridium botulinum produces another nasty toxin that affects skeletal muscles, only in this case it prevents muscle contraction, flaccid paralysis, botulism. If these bacteria are left in canned food after it's manufactured and sits on the shelf long enough, some of that exquisitely toxic botulinum toxin will be produced and it will cause fatal botulism. Clostridium perfringens causes gangrene. Sometimes when there's bad circulation in an extremity, for example, after a traumatic injury or someone who has late stage diabetes mellitus complications, some anaerobic bacteria can get in there and start decaying the tissue right in place. It's called gangrene. And so we'll talk more about that at a later time. Clostridium difficile, I'm sure you've heard of C. diff. Well, Clostridium difficile is the problem bacteria in that case. Clostridium difficile with some bad virulence factors can cause infection in the digestive tract. It causes ulcerative colitis. It can cause colon inflammation. It can even cause ulceration, sores on the inside of the intestine, cause very severe disease indeed. And occasionally, what happens is people have a small amount of C. diff growing in their GI tract, and if they take antibiotics to treat some other bacterial infection, it disrupts the balance of commensal bacteria in their intestines, and the C. diff bacteria are able to overgrow, and then they cause disease. So, pretty terrible disease also. Talk to some healthcare providers as you're continuing through your training if you're in that area, and undoubtedly someone will have a story to tell about a C. diff infection that they got. I'm trying to think. I think this is especially troublesome when it comes to um, ciprofloxacin, Cipro, particular antibiotic. So that's a commonly used antibiotic, unfortunately. No more noise. Mycoplasmas. Mycoplasmas are the smallest free-living bacteria or cells in general. They're tiny. They have no cell wall. That's one of their sort of claim to fame. And they cause a lung infection potentially called walking pneumonia. So it's bad enough that they're actually infecting your lungs and your immune system is not seeming to get a handle on it. At the same time, you're well enough that you're still kind of trying to slog through your work week or whatever. So that's so-called walking pneumonia designation. They're a little bit difficult to grow, and here's the kind of colonies they produce. They produce these so-called fried egg appearance colonies, and characteristic of these mycoplasmas. Oh, there I go. All right, Bacillus. Bacillus is a shape of bacteria, yes, but it's also a genus of bacteria. So Bacillus anthracis is an important bacteria that causes the disease anthrax. And anthrax can be in your skin. You can have cutaneous anthrax. It can be in your digestive system if you eat too much anthrax, or it can be inhaled into the lungs. Remember, Bacillus genus makes um, endospores, and if you inhale the endospores into your lungs, you'll get most likely a fatal infection. It'll cause such a terrible infection that your immune system will not have a chance to fight it off before you succumb. So it's a very, very serious thing indeed. But usually it doesn't happen. People don't get anthrax endospores in their lungs unless someone intentionally poisons them with them. There's been a couple of cases of people being poisoned with anthrax endospores by opening up letters that were sent to them in the mail with the powdered endospores in the letter in the envelope. The biggest problem with anthrax is loss of revenue from domestic animals, and they get diseased, and it's a pretty nasty disease. So if you may remember way back when, I believe it was Pasteur who was trying to figure out a solution, a cure for anthrax in farm animals in Europe. Staphylococcus. Staphylococcus causes a bunch of different kinds of infections and problems, but Staphylococcus aureus, one of the common staph infections on the bacteria that lives on your surface of your body, can cause some diseases, which we'll talk about in several different later chapters. So we probably won't spend a ton of time talking about it right now. Just so you know, it's a type of bacteria. So remember, staph bacteria can often live on the surface of the skin, even though it's very salty and dry there, and can cause toxic shock syndrome. There's toxins that can be produced by Staphylococcus that can cause food poisoning. If you have leftover food that keeps getting put in the fridge, pulled back out, reheated, put back in the fridge, pulled back out. The claim to fame with staph is that the staph enterotoxin is not destroyed by heat. You can knock back the bacteria, but you can't do anything about the toxin, and you can become intoxicated, meaning poisoned by it. All right. I'll have plenty of time to talk about staph bacteria later on. Listeria monocytogenes is a terrible one because it can cross the placenta and get into the fetus and cause stillbirth or fatal fetal infection. So listeria is a really scary kind of a thing. It's not very common, luckily, but listeriosis can occur. You can become infected by contaminated cold cuts. That was the classic thing. Cold cuts, processed meats, but also the most recent outbreaks that I've heard about were in vegetables. So vegetables handled by farm workers who have fetal exposure of listeria. They contaminate the vegetables, and then you eat the salad and voila. So listeriosis. Lactobacillus is a important commensal bacteria that maintains an acidic pH in a healthy vagina. So you want that acidic pH because most microorganisms don't grow under acidic pHs. It suppresses the growth of other things. So you have this harmless bacteria, a commensal, that just helps control other organisms. And if you are too fastidious, you can actually be too fastidious. If you douche out all the lactobacillus bacteria, you can actually wind up getting yeast infections and other bacterial infections because of removing those nice acid-producing microorganisms, lactobacillus. Streptococcus causes more different diseases and more commonly causes disease than any other genus of bacteria. So that's going to be a huge thing we're going to encounter over and over in our various chapters. Streptococcus pyogenes causes skin and cardiovascular diseases. Streptococcus pneumoniae can cause pneumonia and possibly meningitis. Streptococcus mutans is a group of different bacterial species that can cause tooth decay. So we'll have a chance to talk more about strep bacteria. These are, by the way, I didn't really mention, remind you that staph and strep are cocci that grow either in clusters, staphylococcus, or in long strands, streptococci. I probably realize I should probably mention that. And listeria is a bacillus. right, Enterococcus fecalis and Enterococcus faecium are enteric bacteria, but they cause a lot of trouble in terms of nosocomial infections. Both staph and Enterococcus, among others, are causing a lot of problems with antibiotic-resistant strains. So methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, I'm sure you've heard of that, is a growing problem in the community as well as in the hospitals. Enterococcus infections of people that have indwelling catheters, for example, is a big problem. There's vancomycin resistant Enterococcus species. So we're getting into trouble with some of our best antibiotics, resistant strains of microorganisms. There you can see Clostridium. Remember, Clostridium and Bacillus are the genre, mix that up, that produce endospores. There's an endospore forming as the rest of the bacteria deteriorates. There's some Staphylococcus aureus, the gold-colored colonies, and Streptococcus, the chains of cocci. All right, now we come to the high GNC bacteria that have greater than 50% of GNC in their genomes. Actinobacteria is the name of the phylum. So we had Firmicutes, now we're in Actinobacteria. And we'll be looking at some of these species, and there you see listed here at the bottom. Corynebacterium diphtheriae. Diphtheria is a very severe respiratory infection that can cause such swelling in the pharynx that it completely closes off and causes suffocation. It caused a lot of childhood fatalities, mortality in the times before antibiotics were prevalent, before vaccines were available. And now everyone, most everyone is vaccinated in this country in infancy and in childhood for diphtheria. Mycobacterium leprae and tuberculosis. We've talked a bit about them because they're famous for producing that mycolic acid-rich cell wall, which makes them very hard to stain, but makes them stainable by this acid-fast method where we use that carbol-fuchsin stain and heat to drive the stain into the cell wall, and then use the acid alcohol, hot acid alcohol destain, which destains all other cell types and produces pink mycobacterium. Baby, we got a couple of barkers here. All right, so where was I? We'll talk a lot more about leprosy and tuberculosis later on. Propionibacterium acne causes infections in the skin of adolescents and causes familiar pimples. Gardnerella vaginalis causes infections in the vagina, which can be uncomfortable and odoriferous. Actinomycetes are not disease-causing microorganisms, but they're left in here because they produce a lot of antibiotics. Oh, I take that back. Opportunistic infections of the oral cavity as well. I've forgotten about that. Abscess in the oral cavity. Oh, I have a visitor coming to see me. Who could it be? You see this fellow right here? He's the newest member of the family. All right, got his 2 seconds of fame. Okay, so as I was mentioning, the biggest issue with actinomycetes or actinobacteria of this particular genus is the antibiotics. Antibiotics, remember, are antimicrobial chemicals that are isolated from existing microorganisms. So very important for some of the antibiotics we can get from these guys. They form long chains that can reproduce by breaking off pieces that can then go on to grow into new bacteria. Cyanobacteria and anoxygenic bacteria we won't talk about. Probably a lot of bacteria in the soil, and most of them are perfectly harmless. Many bacteria have not been identified or cultured, so There's a lot to be done if there are scientists who are interested in cataloging as many as possible, and so there's a constant effort being made to some degree to find out what's out there and what their properties are. Partly because we'd like to find some more new antibiotics that have different mechanisms of action, because there's becoming so many antibiotic resistant bacteria that cause diseases that we are having a harder and harder time defeating. It'd be nice if we could continue to survey the natural world and find more antibiotics out there. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 11, and join me next time for chapter 12, when I believe we'll be talking about viruses, viri.